Hello, everyone. I'm Mabel Chan. Welcome to my podcast, One in a Billion. Today, we wrap up our fall series, Find Your Roots, with a final episode about Asians in New York. Find Your Roots is about Asian American mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, looking back at the roots of their family history, cultural identity, and personal journey, one person at a time.
My name is Sheetal Sheth. Maru naam Sheetal che. Mera naam Sheetal hai. Je m'appelle Sheetal. I was born in Phillipsburg, New Jersey in 1976.
Sheetal Sheth is the wife of Neil Modi. You may remember Neil was our guest in the last episode 2 weeks ago. Sheetal and Neil both identify as Indian American, and Sheetal sees herself as a storyteller, mostly in acting.
So I have been acting since the 90s, back when brown was not cool. So it has been many decades, over 25 years.
Sheetal has won wide acclaim in Hollywood through her many memorable roles. My personal favorite, her lead role as Maya with Albert Brooks in the 2005 film Finding Comedy in the Muslim World, and the main filming location, New Delhi, India.
I love India. I'm very connected to India, and I like to go back often. It is far away, but I try to find pieces of India in different places, and part of that is going home to see my family in Pennsylvania.
In this episode, Sheetal talks about her deep ties to India and how that affects her writing, parenting, and acting career. Here's our conversation. Hello, Sheetal. Welcome to One in a Billion, our special series, Find Your Roots.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to speak with you.
Sheetal, I am blown away by the wide variety and depth of your accomplishments. An award-winning actor, producer in film and television, an activist for marginalized communities, and author of 3 children's books. The latest new book is Making Happy, released in 2022. That's following Always Anjali in 2018 and Bravo Anjali 2021. So I want to start the conversation by asking about these children's books. Can you take me back to the moment that triggered your interest or desire to write children's books?
As far back as I can remember, since I was 5 years old, I've been working with children, and I love it. And it's pure joy for me in very different capacities. So when I was at NYU, I took a lot of classes. I don't know if it's officially the case, but enough to where I would have gotten a minor in education, in elementary education. That's how much I'm interested in it. And if I wasn't an actor and doing all these things, I would 100% be a teacher. So I feel like what I do now is really great because I can combine all of my loves. The books had always been something in the back of my mind. I always wanted to write children's books. It kind of came forefront in my life when I was pregnant with my first daughter. I remember being very hot because I was having an August baby, and I was very hot walking around New York City and very pregnant, and would find solace in bookstores just to get into some air conditioning and reading a little bit. And so I just started spending hours in bookstores and reading and kind of reconnecting to that piece of me that I always loved, that I hadn't kind of thought about in a while. I was very distressed at the state of what I was seeing. Now, this was 10 years ago, and I found that many of the books were the same books that I had growing up. And I thought, oh my God, it's been 30 some years, and why aren't there more? Why isn't there more for everybody? So then I ended up becoming obsessed. I started going online. I was ordering books from like old library collections and that, just so I could like see what was out there. But for the most part, if there was a person of color, certainly someone of Indian background, it would be very much centered around religion or holidays or cultural celebrations. And I kept saying to myself, do they know that we also have dinner with our parents and play sports and go to school and play instruments and do everything that all other kids do? We don't sit around wearing saris and bindis all day. And if you read these books, that's what you would think. And so I really got incensed. So for me, I channel my rage through my work. And so I started writing. The impetus was really, I want slice of life stories about us. We are the center of the story, or the hero of our own story, but that the narrative is really about kid stuff with the culture filtered in.
Then what led to the focus on Anjali, happiness, and courage?
The Anjali series became its own thing. I was reading picture books, which are timeless and they're for everybody, but they're generally for ages 4 to 10. I love them. And there was no picture book series that had an Indian American at the center of it, period. And I thought we deserve to have a character too. So I wrote Always Anjali about this girl who wants to change her name to, quote, fit in, is based on very personal things that I had experienced in my life as a child and then as an adult when I started acting. And everyone told me I had to change my name to work. In fact, I lost jobs because I didn't change my name. And so I feel like it's so relatable not being able to find your name on these tchotchkes, on a license plate, on a key, which, by the way, I live in New York City. The same 20 names still exist. I remember going to my acting manager at the time and saying, I wrote this book. And she basically was like, it's great. Good luck. You're on your own. Through many years of kind of doing what I did, finally found a rep, finally sold it. When the book came out, it did really well. And I think we touched on something. And so now I could say, oh, well, now I really can do my series. And so I wrote the next book and the next book. Now we're at Penguin Random House. Always Anjali, the anniversary edition just came out a few months ago. And they see something that's really special. And I feel very proud that this character in this series has become so beloved. The other book that you're referring to, Making Happy, is its own book that I wrote, which came out last fall. That was probably the most personal book I've written to date. I wrote it when I was diagnosed with breast cancer and I was going through chemotherapy and my kids were super young and I was looking for books, once again, looking for books to kind of have the conversation, and there were no books. I went to bookstores and asked, and they're like, children's books don't really deal with grief and death and sad things or scary things. And I said, well, that's a problem because kids are dealing with sad and scary things.
You were dealing with breast cancer. When and how did that come to become a topic of conversation between you and your daughter?
Well, I mean, my kids at the time were 2 and 4, so they were quite young. And I wrote the book that I desperately needed to have for my family. I wanted to write a book that's told from the point of view of this little girl whose mom is sick. And she's going through all the emotions, angry, sad, scared. It's okay to have whatever feeling you're having. And I wanted to give space for that. So for me, this book was very much about how do you make happy when your world is scary or sad. It's really about honoring the feelings that we all have in those moments.
That is so incredible. I wonder, when you're writing Making Happy, did you have your older daughter in mind? I have no children, so I don't know that 4-year-old can understand what you're going through, but I imagine they can.
They could understand that they couldn't hug their mommy for a few months when I had a double mastectomy, or they couldn't lay on me, which was the favorite thing that they could do, or I was tired, or why was I home and why couldn't I play with them the way that I could play with them normally? And so I think it's in the everyday that feels no one wants to see their parent sick, you know? Now, I will say, since the book came out, we have had such different conversations because they see themselves in the book. I think it has made them kinder and more empathetic people, because I notice it when we're outside and they see someone with no hair, or they see someone with a wrap, or they see someone who may not be well. They think of me and they treat these people with kindness.
What's their feedback to your book?
My oldest, her name is Ember, and my youngest, her name is Maven. Ember will be 9 next month, and Maven is 6 right now. They had a lot of questions. They're like, Mom, did this happen to you? Did you really? They don't remember the specifics of things. And so there is a scene in that book where the little girl asks her mom, why did you get sick? Why? I've had those questions and there are no answers for them, but how do you answer that with your child? And so it's a very honest conversation that I don't think anyone should shy away from. And so if this book gives even a little bit of help or feeling of love to anyone going through a hard time, that makes me really happy.
That's amazing. Now, what about your parents? Have they read it? What did they say?
No, I think my parents are kind of stunned and proud at the writer I've become. I feel very fortunate, honestly, to have a creative outlet that I can control and do anytime I want. I'm a very productive person, and telling me I can't do something makes me crazy. So I couldn't act. I couldn't do a lot of the movie stuff that I had normally done while I was going through chemotherapy, but I could write. And so it became my savior.
Wow, that's awesome. I'm still curious about your parents' reaction. Did they see their parenting style in the same or different way as you've described in your children's book?
My parents are immigrants from India. They were born and raised there. They had an arranged marriage and they moved here really looking for a better life in the 60s and 70s. My mom is one of nine. My dad is one of five. And so there was no privilege of conversation about feelings that I think we do with our children. They were just trying to get through the day. They didn't speak English as well as they do now. My mom is like grinding peas to make dal. I mean, it seems crazy because now everything is so readily available, but at that time it wasn't. I think that me and my husband are, and a lot of people who are first generation in this country, we have the privilege of being able to actually have some EQ and talk to our children, which I think is so important.
Let's turn to your parents' immigration journey. When did your parents come to America and why?
My dad came to America in the 60s to get his master's, and he ended up at Brigham Young in Utah. That's where he got into and what they could afford. And it was a Mormon school. And he talks about it because he was one of maybe a handful of people of color there.
What was he studying?
He's a chemical engineer.
Okay.
He had roommates. They all took turns making food. They were busboys. They were making money however they could. And he went back to India, ready to get married, and did the very traditional arranged marriage where his parents were setting him up with different people. This is the story that my mom and dad have told me. They met, and my mom didn't want to come to America, but her family was like, no, it'll be good for you. And so they got married in 1972. So it's been 51 years now.
In India or?
In India. Yep. In India.
Okay.
After meeting just a few times. And they moved here in 1972 and really scraped their way to the life that they have now.
Well, where did they choose to put down their roots and why?
It was very much defined by my dad's job. When they first came, lived in Hoboken, and then my dad got a job and they moved to Phillipsburg, New Jersey. He's worked at the same company and it was part of Procter & Gamble for over 30 years.
Loyalty is very much rewarded.
Yes, and he liked it. And he liked it. So they moved into a tiny little apartment in Phillipsburg where they had my sister and me. And then my brother, there's a 6-year gap between me and my brother. And they were saying, we need more room. We moved to Pennsylvania because New Jersey got too expensive. The property taxes, I remember my dad saying we can't afford a house here. So if we just move 20 minutes over the border, there's this place called Bethlehem where there's just land. I mean, literally, it was just farmland. Wow. And they were selling plots. And he said, we can buy a plot. Wow. So they built a house. Of course, me and my sister weren't happy because I was 12 and she was 14. Who wants to move then? We were going to Catholic school our whole life. And then I end up in Pennsylvania. We move. I go to a big public school for the first time, which was a huge shock. But we moved. And then my brother started elementary school there. So for him, his whole life is pretty much Pennsylvania.
How tough was their immigrant journey? I mean, getting work, getting acclimated to a new place with strangers, climate difference, cultural differences.
Yeah, I think it was hardest on my mom. I think for my dad, this is what he wanted to do. Obviously, and my mom agreed to it, but my dad was off working all day. And my mom had to figure everything out on her own. She literally was grinding vegetables to make meals. And they had very little money at the time. She's just trying to make a home. She left all of her friends, her whole family. No one else from her family had moved here. I still remember this, them calling home, calling India. They would write those letters that would take weeks to get there. I remember when they would get a letter back from one of their parents, they would get so excited. My mom's father died when I was very young, so it was really just her mom. My dad's parents were alive through my high school years. And so we went back every 2 or 3 years and spent 3 to 4 months every summer in India. And so I think
Wow.
that's why I'm so connected to it. It's why I'm so fluent in the language. I'm very close to my family there. I love going there and I have so many memories. My mom and dad needed that to see their parents.
So who, your dad, your mom, was the force driving the going back?
I think my dad wanted to go back, but my mom would always stay for 3 months and my dad would come back in 6 weeks because of work. But my mom's like, why do I have to go back? My mom was also very funny. She had no issue bringing me back to school late in October sometime. She was like, my kids need to be here. They're getting so much out of it. This is where we're from. And they were fine with it.
Did you witness or hear stories from your mom in particular, since you mentioned it was harder for her? Did she experience any kind of discrimination? And how and where would that show up?
You know, I will tell you, my parents, like a lot of immigrant parents, were very much about keep your head down, do the work, don't cause a fuss. They were so happy to be here. They were so grateful to be in America, and they really just wanted to work and do a good job. So when things would happen and things would happen, or I've noticed things, they would never acknowledge it. They would accept like slurs or stereotypes.
Oh, you're kidding.
I think now is different because they've been in this country much longer than they were in India. But at that time, they didn't know any better.
Right. Well,
So
let
they
me
wouldn't
ask,
complain.
what did they teach you about their experiences as immigrants, what they have gone through? That served you well?
It's all by example, really. The work ethic is unmatched. And I know I can outwork anybody. And that's from seeing my parents. And so I feel like I'm made of steel. And I know that's because of my parents. And I saw how hard they worked and what they had to deal with and how they literally created this life. What they prioritized. They're not the kind of people that are going to have these big conversations about it. They just do it.
Right, by example. So let me ask you then the priorities. How did they prioritize the Indian tradition or beliefs? Did you listen wholeheartedly or did you find them onerous?
Community was really important to them. And I think my advocacy comes from that, because I was always with them. My dad and my mom, but particularly my dad, got really involved and was one of the founders of the very first Hindu temple in our community. Him and a few other families got together and literally built this temple that has become the centerpiece of over thousands of families that now visit. And it's one of the only temples that exists that is multi-faith. And I'm really proud of that. It was a place where I spent every weekend, like Sunday school. On Sundays, I would be dancing. I was part of the youth club. Everything that my dad created for adults, we created for kids. I was very much the organizer of those kinds of things. It was very much a part of my life.
I think that I was a little confused. When you say mixed religion, can you explain?
So the temple that my dad was one of the founders of, under this, they have deities that represent Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism.
Oh,
So it's multi-faith, where normally you go to a temple and it's usually just one faith that is represented. This represents multiple ones.
I see. And your mother, same way?
What do you mean?
Oh, because if I remember correctly, you were raised Catholic. Did I hear you say that?
No. So I know it's confusing. I went to Catholic school.
Okay.
But I was not raised Catholic. So at the time, because academics and education was the most important thing, they put me and my sister into a Catholic school because it was the one that they could afford. That was the best in the neighborhood. And so they were very much like, you're going to go to the school, just don't do all the religious stuff. Even though I took religion class, but we went to mass every Friday, but I didn't take communion. My parents are actually Jain. Hinduism is probably the predominant religion from India, but they're Jain, a smaller sect.
Well, thank you for explaining all of that, because I really have to confess, I knew none of that.
Most people don't. I mean, I will say I know more about Catholicism than most people would expect too, but that's Catholic school.
Sheetal, you were born in New Jersey and then we moved to
Bethlehem.
So what was it like growing up in your neighborhoods?
When I lived in Phillipsburg, because that's where I was born and raised, I would leave my home. My mom's like, okay, just be back in time for dinner. And I would just play with the kids on my street. And I have such memories of like the boy who lived across the street, the girl I played with who was 2 houses down. There's another good friend of mine that was down that alleyway. And you just go to people's houses and be like, can so-and-so play? Can so-and-so play? And I really would just come home for dinner. And so I wasn't aware of the kind of racial or the immigrant piece of it. My mom's best friend was a Hungarian immigrant who
Oh,
lived up the street. And we would often go to her house after school. She had a daughter who was my older sister's age, but I would always tag along. We would just go to her friend's house after school and just spend the afternoons there. I'd have dinner there. And so my mom had her friends and we had our friends and we all just kind of lived our life. It's funny when I look back, I certainly unpack and she probably found kinship with this other immigrant woman, you know? I think that they probably found a lot of commonality. It wasn't until I moved to Pennsylvania, I was older then, that I noticed the difference. I was the new kid and I was the new kid of color. I was also the new Indian kid in town when there's like only three of you. When you grow up with people and you start elementary school and preschool and it's all the same people, no one notices it as much at that point. But when
right.
you're new, all those markers and how you identify and the things that they can see, how you present your color, your skin, all the stuff becomes the thing.
Like what? Give me an example or a story.
I remember walking into seventh grade and not seeing many kids who looked like me. It was a public school. So I went from my whole class, every grade, 25 kids taught by nuns in Catholic school, to public school. My high school was over 2,000 people.
Wow.
So our classes were 600 people. So it was hugely different.
Wow.
Yes.
Were you bullied at all?
No, I wouldn't say, but I think the microaggressions. I remember when I was in high school and I wanted to try out for the play, they didn't cast people who looked like me. So I didn't end up even doing many school plays because there was no place for me on the stage. And so I ended up having to do a lot of community theater. And all of these things are racist things, but they wouldn't know it at that time. We didn't have words for it.
But did you know it? Did you feel angry?
I was finding the words for it. I feel very lucky to have the temple every weekend. I had a bunch of Indian friends who were very similar to me in that we had our school life and then we had our Indian friends' life.
They ground you.
They ground you. And I can also say I'm really proud of our very tight-knit community of South Asian families. We had a really tragic thing happen when we had moved to Pennsylvania. There was an Indian family that we were very close to. The older daughter was my sister's age. The younger daughter was my age. And the older daughter took her own life. It rocked our community. In that moment, my dad and the other leaders of the community rose to the occasion. And I don't think they knew what to do or how to do it, but they're like, that's never going to happen again. And we are going to start finding space for people to talk about how hard it is, because it's hard. The story of like being first generation and trying to figure out who you are. I'm not Indian enough. I'm not American enough. And that was what led to my friend's death. And our parents were like, that can never happen again. We have failed our children. How can we do better? That really changed the tone of conversations.
I'm so sorry to hear. How old was she when she took her life?
She was in high school.
I bet that probably made such an imprint on your psyche that fueled your desire to emphasize better communication across generation, across cultures about children's developmental psyche.
Yeah, that's my point. There was no EQ. There was no talking about feelings in our homes. I don't blame them. They just had other things that they were prioritizing. I had very strict parents. I had to lie to do anything, to have a social life.
Like what?
Like if I wanted to go out with a boy or I wanted to go out with my friends or go to the mall or whatever, we all lied because our parents, I can joke about it with them now. And I always say to them, you guys left India and you took this imprint of what India was when you left in 1970. And that's what you think India still is. And they didn't grow with the times. They've romanticized people in India. So when I go back to India, Mabel, I have cousins in India that are far more Western than I am.
Yes.
They have modernized. Everybody has the internet. My parents were living in like the Twilight Zone. They had this fantasy that they could come here for a better life, but keep us very Indian. They didn't want us to actually become American. There's the obvious, like no dating, no boys. Again, that comes from them having an arranged marriage. They didn't date. But there is basically like a pre-screen process. The families decide okay, these 5 or 6 people are on paper. You can meet them and choose from there. For them, dating was an American thing.
So wait, how did you introduce Neil? I gotta ask, how did you introduce Neil into the picture? Did you reject all five on their list?
My parents knew better than to try to do an arranged marriage with me. But I wasn't bringing boyfriends home. They didn't meet anyone in my life except for Neil. And it wasn't until we were together for like 7 years.
Wow.
We didn't have the kind of relationship where I could be like, oh, this person is going to come home for dinner. That's not going to happen. I will say, this is the benefit of having 2 older sisters. My younger brother had a different experience, but I think it's because me and my sister wore my parents down. And by the time he was dating, also he's a guy, and I think they treat guys differently. That's part of the culture. He was allowed to do things that like my sister and I would never have been able to do.
Wow, 7 years with Neil. But the point I really wanted to drill down a bit more is that you were able to spare Neil from meeting with your parents until you were sure so that you don't upset your parents.
To be fair, I think they would have been okay with me bringing home people. When I was in college, it would never have happened in high school. They're like, do your studies. That was the most important thing. I remember in middle school, there was this boy in 8th grade that asked me to go to a movie. And I went to my mom and asked her if I could go. And her reaction was like so through the roof that I was like, okay, never going to do that again.
And so you wanted to keep the peace at home, and your parents were never so worried about your marriageability.
If I'm going to take someone home, it's got to be someone you're serious about. And again, Neil was probably the first person that I would have done that with.
Right. But your parents would not be asking you or badgering you. You know what I mean?
They would. The minute you bring home a boyfriend at that age, that's the thing. Like, what's the deal?
But here's the thing, Sheetal, is that Chinese women are being badgered by their parents. It was like leftover women. Have you heard that term before?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's the same thing with the Indians. Look, Neil and I got married very late in our life. We were together. We didn't know if we were even going to get married, but we were going to be together. Like, that in itself was such blasphemy to my parents. My mom got married at like 23 or 24, and my dad was 27, not till 38. So for them, they were like, are you kidding me? If you're not married in your 20s, it's over. And the Indians, it's like, what's wrong with that woman?
So the same with like Chinese too.
Yeah, the Asians have a lot in common in that way.
So your parents, how did they express their hopes and dreams for your future?
I don't think my parents still know what I do. Here's the thing. I graduated at the top % of my high school class. I wasn't valedictorian, but they still chose me to speak over the valedictorian. And so for my parents, they were like, you're so smart and you have all this potential. You're going to go become an actor. To them, that was like a letdown, to be honest. There was nobody that looked like me doing what I was doing at that time. So they had no framework. They had no reference. They thought, what does that even mean? You need a job. And it all came from the love of, we need to have a stable job where you can provide for your family.
It was a source of conflict for you too.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
How did you resolve that? How did you turn them around?
Through times. I say this to people in my life that have a hard time with their parents. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt us. It doesn't mean it's not upsetting to us, but framing it in a way that our parents don't know any better, or our parents have been brought up in a certain way. This is the way that they experience the world. I always say this. My dad wanted to be an engineer. He went and became an engineer. My mom had thoughts and dreams. She never got to live them, but she didn't know any different. We have the great privilege of being able to do whatever we want. That would be insane. In India, what happens after you graduate high school is there are 2 tracks. It's either you're going to be an engineer or you're going to be a doctor. That's why there's so many of them.
For men and women.
For men and women. And a lot of times women will go to college, but then you get married. It was very unusual if you didn't.
So let me ask you, Sheetal, how did you convince them that you are going to go to acting school, you're going to get an MFA, or did you just do it and then you were successful and then they come around?
I didn't tell them, actually. They knew I was in acting school, but I also told them that I was a double major in psychology.
How about peer support? Were you able to get any peer support from your Indian friends or American friends in acting?
I didn't know anybody that was Indian who was an actor. And I went to School of the Arts. I think one other kid, he was Indian. but I was living in a bubble. NYU was amazing. Tisch is an amazing school, but it's a bit of a bubble because you're kind of shielded by the business part of entertainment. And then I graduated. And then I started meeting with agents and managers and casting directors. And the questions they were asking me, what name are you going to change? Asking me all these questions about my ethnicity and this and what you're playing. And I came from a world where like, you're allowed to do whatever you want. You play whatever part you want. You're on stage. We're working on our craft. And then all of a sudden I'm dealing with the business, and it's very much a business. And to them, I was in something that they didn't know how to label or what box to put me in.
When and who gave you your first break?
Well, I did an independent movie called ABCD, and I met in that movie. I played, and it's very much, it was a South Asian writer and director who was telling a story from his life. And I played the lead young female who was struggling, had an older brother and dealing with her traditional Indian mom. And that movie revolutionized the story of the first generation South Asian person in the US. It became a stalwart. It was honest. It came out in the 98. I don't think people were ready for it. We were way ahead of our time, a lot of the movies that I did. In that, I found community with other brown actors because
Nice.
projects, and some of them are my best friends to date.
Oh, that's fantastic. You know, Sheetal, I tried to watch that and I couldn't. I have to buy DVD for it.
Oh my God.
But I wanted to watch it in
Yeah.
preparation for today. So guess what I watched instead?
What did you watch?
I am so blown away by you with Al Brooks
Oh, you watched Looking for Comedy.
looking for comedy in a Muslim world. You
Yes.
know, when I saw you in it, I gotta tell you, Sheetal, you reminded me of Audrey Hepburn.
Oh, that's very
You
nice.
you really did.
That's very kind. Thank you
It's
for that.
cool. I'm sure that's not the first time you've heard this.
I have heard it before, but it's honestly so sweet. And I don't really know what to do with that because she's amazing, but I appreciate it.
I really am so happy to hear how you got started and your perseverance, your break. Everyone needs a break. So you starred in over 20 feature films and won numerous Best Actors awards globally. What was your favorite role and why?
So that's like asking me who my favorite child is, which is impossible. I'm super, super proud of the work that I've done in that it's varied. I don't repeat myself each movie. I center stories that were never told before. I'm really proud at the depth and breadth of roles that I was able to do.
You're very well known as an outspoken advocate for marginalized communities and have been active in community outreach and politics. So how would you trace the roots of your political and social activism?
Well, the social activism is very much because of my family and because they created a space for the South Asian families. Like I said, there's thousands of families who find solace in this temple that my dad was a big part of creating. And so community has always been a big part of me. I'll tell you an interesting story. When I was in high school, there was this movement where community service needed to be a requirement to graduate from high school. My senior year, we were the first graduating class that had to do 60 hours of community service over 4 years in order to graduate. And I was like, oh, easy. I could do that in my sleep. But there were a number of students that did not think that that was ethical, did not want that to be a requirement. It divided our town. It became a huge political thing. One of my friends sued the school. That also shaped me because I was really sad that that was a debate. Like 60 hours over 4 years is not a lot. For me, this idea that you can't teach your children that community and volunteering, it's important for your life.
Since you end on that note, then let me ask this. What are the most important values or beliefs that are unique to your cultural heritage that you want to make sure you pass on to your children?
I will say community is a big part of that, being inclusive and really seeing everybody as your brother and sister is important. And I think that's very much tied to my Indian culture. When people talk about India and the Indian people, they talk about the people. and the spirit and the generosity that is grounded in respect, in love, in community. I think the values of nonviolence and Gandhi very much pervade India and all of us. And this idea of treating others the way you want to be treated, including animals.
Since you mentioned those very Indian specific cultural essence, right, that you want to make sure that your daughters grow up with not just appreciation, but a deep sense. And perhaps that's the reason you took the whole family to spend a month in India last December, right?
Yeah, so I have been dying to take my kids to India since they were born, because when I became an adult, I used to go to India every year on my own because I loved it. So I went to India right before I got married, and then I had Ember, and then I had Maven, and then I got cancer, and then it was COVID. So all of a sudden 9 years went by, which is how old my daughter is now.
How did they react when they were in India for a month?
They loved it.
That's fantastic. Any striking question they asked that surprises you, or?
Look, it's a lot. It's a lot for the senses when you go to India. I mean, and I kind of tried to prepare them for what they were going to see. The thing about India is there's huge dichotomy. There's the most beautiful, rich parts of our culture, and there's also the very poor, tragic parts of what's going on there. You know, they were very open, and I was too.
At this stage in your life, how do you see your roots coming out more so than before? Either your Indian roots or your American roots since you were born here.
Well, I will say being a parent and thinking about how I want to raise my children has really brought these questions top of mind for me. And Neil and I talk about it all the time. A lot of it is, do we want to raise our children in faith? What parts of the culture are important to us? I love my culture, but a lot of the traditions are based in patriarchy. That's not what I want for my kids. And so it's about kind of modernizing and making traditions our own in a way that works for us.
I'm curious to hear how you would describe the same or different ways that your Indian culture and identity show up in your everyday life compared to Neil. It could be your eating habit, meditation, yoga practice, parenting style, or life philosophy.
I think Neil would probably agree with this. I think I'm more Indian than he is in a lot of ways. I speak the language fluently. I also read and write. He can understand it, but he's not fluent in the language. When we go to India, I can communicate with the elders of our family in a way that he can't. And it's the biggest compliment when his family is like, wait, did you grow up in India? And that makes me really happy. So I think there's that nuance that also affords me that. And it comes through my children of like, what's important, what we're doing. It's the food we eat. It's what we do with our time. We're taking our kids to volunteer on Saturday with an organization. It's, again, these things that I want to ingrain in them very young so that this is something that they will hopefully carry on for the rest of their life.
Thank you, Sheetal. Again, Neil Modi, Sheetal's husband, was my guest in our last episode on December 10th. Check it out. Meanwhile, have a wonderful holiday season filled with love, peace, joy, and magic. 1 in a Billion Find Your Roots special series is made possible in part by a generous grant from the Phi Lambda Charitable Trust. We also rely on listeners like you to sustain our production. Please consider supporting our work with a donation. To donate, just go to our website at www.oneinaBillionVoices.org. Click Donate. Your donation is tax deductible. 1 in a Billion is produced by our sound engineer and designer Brian Latwinowicz, and our lovely theme song is composed by Brad McCarthy.